The evacuation was over. The last Concorde warships had jumped away hours ago, their sleek silver hulls vanishing into the abyss. The sky above Vesper 9, once filled with their reassuring presence, was now dark and empty. Captain Elias Vance stood on the observation deck of the colony's main control tower, watching the distant glimmer of departing ships fade into nothing. His fists clenched at his sides, his jaw locked so tight it ached. They had been abandoned. The Concorde's official statement had been simple. Vesper 9 is indefensible. The Vorax swarm is coming. All non-essential personnel must evacuate immediately. The reality was far worse. Non-essential meant anyone who wasn't a politician, high-ranking officer, or wealthy investor. The rest, miners, mechanics, ex-soldiers, and their families, had been left behind. Tens of thousands of them. A bitter laugh escaped him. The Galactic Concorde, with all its power, had looked at the Vorak and decided this battle wasn't worth fighting. But Vance wasn't a politician. He was a soldier. And if the Concorde refused to fight, then humanity would fight alone. Behind him, the control tower was alive with desperate voices. Engineers scrambling to reroute failing power grids, militia officers shouting status reports, civilians searching for lost loved ones. Fear hung thick in the air. Vance turned toward the holotable, where a grainy tactical feed displayed the Vorak fleet still moving beyond the system's edge. They hadn't arrived yet, but the moment they did, the killing would start. A tired voice broke through the chaos. "This is suicide." Vance looked up to see Dr. Asha Patel, the colony's chief engineer. Her brown eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were filled with exhausted fury. "They left us to die," she continued. "We have no fleet, no warships, just..." She gestured around at the crumbling command center. A few mining lasers and half-functional cargo haulers. "This isn't a battle, it's a massacre." Vance exhaled. "Then we make them bleed for every inch." Patel stared at him like he was insane. "You think we can stop the Vorak?" "No," Vance admitted, "but we can hurt them. And we can send a message." She shook her head, rubbing her temples. "Damn it, Elias. I hope you have a plan." "We'll make one," he said. "We don't have a choice." A voice from the comm station interrupted them. "Captain," said Lieutenant Owen Briggs, his second in command, "you need to hear this." Vance strode over, Patel close behind. The lieutenant tapped a few controls, and a transmission crackled to life. "Is Vorak command ship. Surrender now, and your deaths will be painless. Resist, and we will strip the flesh from your bones. There is no victory here, only consumption." The Vorak. The voice was distorted, unnatural, like metal scraping against bone. It wasn't meant for negotiation. It was a declaration. Vance's expression didn't change. He reached down, killed the transmission, and turned back to the room. "They think we're already dead," he said. Silence. Then, slowly, Patel straightened. Her tired gaze hardened. "Then let's prove them wrong." A grim smile crossed Vance's face. "Exactly." The room came alive with urgency. Plans were drawn, weapons counted, defenses prepared. Because tonight, humanity would not go quietly. The sound of boots marching echoed through the cold, dimly lit halls of the colony's central command. Captain Elias Vance was in full uniform, his sharp eyes scanning the faces of the men and women around him, each one marked by determination and a sense of finality. The weight of the situation was palpable. There was no room for doubt. "We fight with what we have," Vance said, his voice steady, almost cold, as he stood at the front of the makeshift war room. "No more hiding. No more running. If the Vorak think we're weak, let's make them regret it. We'll show them exactly what happens when humanity is backed into a corner." Around the table, the other survivors nodded. Dr. Asha Patel stood at one side, her face drawn with fatigue but focused, looking over a schematic of the colony's remaining defenses. Lena Rourke, the former ace pilot, leaned against the wall, her arms crossed but her eyes sharp, every bit as ready for what was coming. "We have 3 days until they arrive," Rourke said, her voice clipped. "That gives us just enough time to prepare, and we'll need every minute of it." Patil stood up, walking over to the table, where a series of holographic images flickered, showing the last-minute adjustments to the colony's defenses. "We've got old mining lasers we can repurpose into anti-air guns, and we're patching together some of the fighter ships. We can use the fusion reactors to rig up a few traps. But none of this is going to be enough. They'll come in overwhelming numbers." Vance's eyes darkened. "The Vorak may have numbers, but we have guile. We can make every shot count. We won't be fighting them on their terms. We'll make this our battlefield." He turned to the map of Vesper 9's surface, now covered in a complex web of improvised traps, ambush points, and chokeholds. "There's a supply depot near the eastern rim," Vance said. "It's well defended, but we can use it as a staging area. We'll draw them in, force them to fight through narrow spaces. Their numbers won't count for much when they're funneled into kill zones." Rourke smirked. "And if we're lucky, we'll take down a few of those ships." She tapped the side of her head, the gleam of her smile hardening into resolve. "I've been flying since I was 14. They won't know what hit them." Patel nodded but looked doubtful. "I'll need to jury-rig the reactors to make sure the blast radius is enough to cripple their ships. It's risky. If we get it wrong, we could wipe out half the colony. I don't think the survivors will appreciate that." Vance didn't flinch. "If we don't do this, there won't be a colony left to worry about. Do it." A tense silence fell over the room as the gravity of their situation settled in. Every plan, every hope, was hanging by a thin thread. But that thread was all they had. It was enough to hold on to. "We're not just surviving this," Vance continued, his voice unwavering. "We're sending a message. The Vorak, the Concord, the whole galaxy. Let them think we're insignificant. Let them think we'll cower and run. Tonight, humanity fights back." The room seemed to hold its breath, the weight of their leader's words sinking deep. Within the hour, teams were already out in the field. The miners were hauling scrap metal to reinforce barricades. The engineers were setting up the jury-rigged energy cannons, while Rourke and her pilots worked tirelessly on the dilapidated fighters, reprogramming old navigation systems and recalibrating weapons. Everyone was pushing beyond their limits, not because they had to, but because they refused to give up. Even the civilians were getting involved. Vance watched as families and children helped assemble crude weapons, homemade explosives, sharpened pipes, scrap metal spears. They were no longer just survivors. They were becoming fighters. As the day turned into night, the first signs of the Vorak fleet began to appear on their radar. "They're here," Rourke reported, her voice sharp and tense. "Looks like they brought everything. The fleet is moving in fast." Vance turned toward the control station. "Let's see what they've got." On the holotable, the Vorak ships loomed in the distance, massive, grotesque, like living horrors of metal and flesh. They were closing in, their sharp silhouettes growing ever larger. Patil, standing beside Vance, murmured, "They won't expect us to be ready." "Good," Vance said, his lips curling into a cold smile. "Let's give them a surprise." The battle for Vesper 9 had begun. The first shockwave of the Vorak attack hit the outer rim of the colony with the force of 1,000 storms. From the ground, it looked like a sunburst, a series of massive explosions cascading across the skyline as the Vorak fleet deployed their invasion pods. Vance's heart pounded in his chest as the battlefield unfolded in front of him. His boots were firmly planted on the rocky ground of the eastern sector, but his eyes were locked on the horizon, where the first dropships fell like meteors. "Here they come." The words were barely audible over the roar of incoming fire, but they were all that mattered. The Vorak had arrived in force. Massive, spiked ships that looked like they were made of jagged bones, their hulls black and pocked with veins of red energy pulsing ominously. But what the Vorak didn't expect was the human tenacity. The colony's defense network, hastily assembled from scavenged materials, roared to life. The old mining lasers that had once carved tunnels into the depths of the planet now cut through the incoming Vorak pods with shocking precision. Explosions erupted in midair, sending debris flying across the battlefield, as the makeshift energy cannons proved far more effective than the Vorak had anticipated. "First wave is down," Rourke's voice crackled over the comm. "I'll take the next batch." She was already in the air, piloting one of the repurposed fighters. Its hull patched together with scrap and held together by sheer will. Her ship roared as she accelerated into the chaos, banking hard around a towering spire of rock. The Vorak had underestimated her, just as they had underestimated humanity. Targeting their dropships, Rourke muttered to herself, lining up her sights. Her hands moved with the precision of a surgeon. She fired. A fighter's missiles tore through the first dropship in a blinding explosion, sending shards of metal and alien flesh scattering through the air. She barely had time to celebrate before her targeting system locked onto another pod. Her voice rang through the comms. "Another one down. How are we doing on the ground?" The response came almost immediately. "We're holding," Vance said, his voice grim. "But they're pushing forward fast. Expect more reinforcements any minute." Patel's voice was tight with tension. "I've got the reactors primed for the final phase, but we need to slow them down. They're coming in waves." "Just hold them back," Vance said, his gaze shifting from the distant sky to the rocky terrain ahead. The Vorak were landing in waves, pouring out of their ships like an unstoppable tide of fury. The colony's walls had been reinforced, but it wouldn't take much for the Vorak to tear through them. The real battle was about to begin. As the first Vorak soldiers hit the ground, they emerged from their drop pods in full biomechanical armor, ruthless, fast, and terrifying. Their grotesque forms were a blend of insectoid biology and mechanical precision, their limbs armed with blades that seemed to hum with deadly energy. They hit the ground in a frenzy, charging toward the colony's defenses. Vance and his militia moved fast, falling into formation as the first wave of warriors charged at them. He could see the hunger in their eyes. These were not soldiers, not warriors. They were predators. And Vesper 9 was their prey. "Hold your ground," Vance shouted, his voice carrying over the line of defense. "Don't let them through." The first few Vorak came in fast, their jagged blades swinging with inhuman speed. A militia soldier on Vance's left fired the first shot, an automated turret she had set up earlier, sending a volley of plasma rounds into the swarm. It bought them a few precious seconds. But the Vorak didn't hesitate. They adapted, they learned, and they came at them from multiple angles, faster than they had anticipated. A soldier to Vance's right fell, his body torn apart by the brute force of a Vorak soldier's claw. He wasn't the first to die, and he wouldn't be the last. But humanity didn't flinch. They didn't run. "Guns up," Vance yelled. The militia returned fire with desperation and fury. Lasers and bullets sliced through the air, ripping through the bodies of Vorak warriors, but they kept coming, relentless and merciless. Rourke's voice came again, urgent. "They're adapting faster than we thought. I need a better angle." "Get clear," Vance ordered. "We're about to give them a new target." Patel's voice echoed in his ear, calm but urgent. "Ready to go in 3, 2, 1. The fusion reactors ignited. A blinding flash of energy erupted from the center of the colony, sending a shockwave through the battlefield. The ground shook as the first makeshift bomb exploded, sending the Vorak scrambling as chunks of debris rained down on them. The concentrated blast tore through their front lines, scattering their forces. It wasn't enough to win the war, but it was enough to make them fear. Vance looked toward the horizon, where more Vorak ships loomed. They were just getting started. But humanity had struck first, and the Vorak had learned their first painful lesson. Never underestimate the will to survive. The battle raged on. The makeshift barricades, built with all the desperation the human spirit could muster, held, just barely. against the relentless onslaught of the Vorak. The ground trembled under the weight of their assault. Every structure in the colony seemed to tremble as if it could collapse at any moment. Yet the humans fought on, turning each crumbling corner into a killing field. Vance's heart pounded, but his mind was sharp. He had seen the horrors of war before, but nothing like this. Nothing as brutal as the Vorak. They fought with no sense of mercy, no strategy beyond simple, overwhelming aggression. They were a force of nature, as unforgiving as a storm, but the humans weren't about to let themselves be swept away. They would stand their ground. Then, just as the tide seemed like it might turn, the transmission came in. "Captain, you need to hear this." Vance turned to see Lieutenant Briggs, his face pale as he motioned for Vance to approach the comm station. The lieutenant wasn't easily rattled, but something in his eyes told Vance this was different. "What's going on?" Vance asked, his voice low but commanding. Briggs tapped the controls, and a faint, crackling transmission flickered to life. The words were garbled, barely understandable at first, but the human voice came through with unmistakable clarity. "This is Agent Kale. Concord Intelligence. I'm..." Vance's eyes widened. He stepped closer to the screen, leaning in. "Cal," Vance muttered, disbelief rippling through him. Cal had been part of the last Concord fleet to depart. Vance had assumed he was long gone, along with the rest of the essential personnel. Yet here he was, alive, somehow trapped beneath the ruins of the colony. "I'm stuck in a facility near the southern sector. I've got something you need to hear." The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by static. Then, a moment later, a distorted image flashed on the screen, showing a man in a crumpled uniform, his face bruised but alive. "We need to find him," Vance said, his voice tight. "Briggs, gather a team. We're going in." "Sir, it's too dangerous," Briggs protested. "The Vorak are everywhere. You can't afford to." "I can't afford not to," Vance interrupted. "That man might have information that changes everything. We can't risk leaving him out there." The lieutenant hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Understood, Captain. I'll assemble a team." Within minutes, Vance and a small team of soldiers, armed and ready for anything, were on their way to the southern sector. The city was on fire. The Vorak were advancing faster than anticipated, but Vance's eyes were focused on the mission ahead. As they moved through the shattered streets, the scene was like something out of a nightmare. Vorak soldiers tore through the last pockets of resistance, their movements savage and swift. The humans on the ground fought back, using whatever weapons they had left. But it was clear that the Vorak were adapting. They had learned from their initial failure. They were no longer taking the bait. They were hunting. Vance led his team through narrow alleys and collapsed buildings, their movements swift but careful. They had to be quick. They couldn't afford to draw the Vorak's attention. The southern sector was a war zone, with debris piled high as the remnants of Vesper 9's infrastructure lay in ruins. After what felt like hours of crawling through the wreckage, they reached the location. The entrance to a secure underground facility, once used for research and storage, now resembled a war-torn bunker. Vance's heart pounded in his chest as they entered, weapons raised, every sense alert. They moved quickly through the darkened hallways, the distant sounds of the battle above growing faint. When they found Cal, he was barely conscious, wedged between piles of broken equipment. He was a mess, dirt streaked across his face, his uniform torn, his body bruised and battered. But his eyes were still sharp, still calculating. "Captain." Cal's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but there was urgency in it. The Vorak. They weren't the real threat. The Concord knew this was coming. They engineered the Vorak to take us down. We were never supposed to survive. Vance's breath caught. "What are you talking about?" Cale coughed, wincing in pain. "It's a test, a sick experiment. The Concord wants to see how long humanity can fight, how long we'll last before we break. The Vorak are just the tools. Vance stood there in stunned silence. His mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. The Concord hadn't just abandoned them, they had condemned them. And now, the real enemy was not the Vorak. It was the galactic powers that had decided humanity was expendable. Before Kel could say more, the facility began to tremble violently. The Vorak had found them. We need to move. Now. Vance snapped, grabbing Kel's arm and pulling him toward the exit. There was no time to waste. The real battle was far from over. The roar of battle echoed through the underground facility as Vance and his team fought to keep their escape route clear. The Vorak were close now. Too close. The air seemed to throb with the sound of their relentless assault above, and the ground shook as though it were alive with the force of the enemy's advance. Kale, despite his injuries, moved with surprising agility as Vance and the others dragged him through the dark corridors. His eyes were darting around, his mind working furiously, processing everything. "We don't have much time, Captain," Kale gasped, his voice pained but urgent. "The Concord, they engineered this war. The Vorak are just a symptom, not the disease. Humanity is the target. They'd been planning this for years." Vance felt the blood drain from his face as the words sank in. The Concord, the very alliance that had promised protection to every human colony, the same faction that had abandoned them without hesitation, was the true enemy. "What do you mean engineered?" Vance demanded, his voice harsh with disbelief. "How? Why? You're telling me the Concord has been using us as, what? Some kind of test?" Kale looked up, his face grim. He paused as they turned a corner, narrowly avoiding a blast from a Vorak energy cannon above. Yes, humanity was never meant to survive the Vorak. The Concord didn't fear the Vorak. They knew they could control them. This was a long-term operation, a social experiment. They wanted to see how much humanity could withstand, how long we could survive under pressure. Vance's mind spun. The pieces were falling into place. The evacuation of Vesper 9, the deliberate abandonment, the sudden silence from the Concord once the Vorak arrived. It all made a terrible kind of sense now. "We've been abandoned, not because they couldn't protect us," Kel continued, "but because they wanted to see if we could fight. They needed to test how far we'd go before breaking. Humanity has been their guinea pig all along." Vance clenched his fists, feeling the weight of betrayal crush his chest. They had left them to die. But even worse, they'd orchestrated the deaths. And now, the Concord wasn't just going to let humanity go. They had a purpose for them. "But that's not all, Captain." Kel's voice dropped to a whisper, and Vance had to lean in to hear him. "They were preparing to wipe us out completely. Humanity was too chaotic, too unpredictable. They saw us as a threat to their order. The Vorak were meant to finish the job." The sudden realization hit Vance like a gut punch. The Concord didn't just want to test humanity. They wanted to eliminate humanity. The Vorak were just a tool in their grand plan. The Vorak are only the first phase of a much larger operation. Kel's voice grew more desperate. "They didn't just want to see if we could survive this. We were meant to fall. They're going to do this again. They'll send another swarm, and then another, until we're nothing but ashes. They'll exterminate us like vermin." Vance's heart was racing now. The full scope of the horror Kel had uncovered hit him like a hammer. This was not just an attack on Vesper 9. It was the first wave of a systematic purge, and humanity had to stop it. They had to make it stop. "There's no way the Concord is getting away with this." Vance's voice was cold, the weight of his resolve settling into his bones. "We need to send a message, not just to the Vorak, but to the Concord, to the whole galaxy. We are not your test subjects, and we're not going down without a fight." Kel's pained eyes locked onto Vance's. "You're right. There's a facility in the central complex, an old Concord relay station. It houses everything. Their communications, their real plan. I can hack into it. I can send a message to Earth, to the galaxy, expose them all." Vance turned to the rest of the team. We're going to that relay station. We'll hit them where it hurts. We have to make this public. Let the entire galaxy know what the Concord did. Briggs, his face grim but determined, nodded. How do we get there, sir? Vance scanned the map of the colony displayed on his comms. The relay station was deep within the city's core, nestled in a district now crawling with Vorak. They'd have to move fast and hard to avoid detection. We moved through the old maintenance tunnels, Vance said. They're less likely to have been compromised. But it's going to be dangerous. Patel, who had remained silent, spoke up, her voice unwavering despite the chaos. We can do this. We've come this far. Vance turned to Kale. How long will it take you to hack the relay? At least 15 minutes. Maybe 20, depending on the security protocols. But I can do it. Kale's voice was strained but resolute. Then we move fast, Vance said. We hit them hard. And we end this. As they moved forward through the tunnels, the hum of battle and the distant roars of the Vorak echoed from above. Vance's heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, but from something else. Rage. The Vorak and the Concord had both made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated humanity's will to fight. And now they would learn the cost of that miscalculation. The tunnels beneath Vesper 9 were dark, narrow, and stank of dust and decay. Once used for maintenance and infrastructure access, they now served as a grim passage through a war zone. Vance led his small team through the maze of metal walls and rusted machinery, his senses on high alert. Each step echoed off the walls, amplifying the heavy silence that clung to the air. Kale stumbled occasionally, his injuries making every movement painful, but his eyes never wavered from the path ahead. Despite the pain, his mind was clear. The man had once been an intelligence officer, and Vance could tell he was a master of compartmentalizing fear and focusing on the mission. Stay close, Vance ordered, his voice low. We don't have time to get separated. The Vorak are everywhere. Briggs and Patel flanked him, their faces grim but determined. They had all seen horrors in their time. Vance knew that well. But the stakes now were higher than anything they had ever faced. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about a reckoning. The deeper they moved into the tunnels, the more it felt like they were entering the belly of the beast. The humming of distant energy fields grew louder as they approached the heart of the colony. The relay station was situated near the central command complex, a massive structure of steel and reinforced concrete, now surrounded by Vorak soldiers. The heart of the colony was under siege. We're almost there, Kale muttered, his breath shallow as he fought through the pain. We just need to get past the security checkpoints. Once we're in the main building, I can access the relay systems. Vance gave a terse nod. No time to waste. As they reached the final access hatch to the relay station, Vance halted. There were no guards at this entrance, at least not yet, but the signs of a fierce battle were clear. The walls were scorched, the floor covered in smears of blood and signs of a hasty retreat. Looks like we're not the only ones trying to get inside, Briggs muttered. The Vorak are making their way here too. Patel's eyes narrowed as she surveyed the area. The relay station is too important for them to leave unguarded. We can't let them breach it. Cal's hand shook as he keyed in the override code. The heavy metal door slowly ground open, revealing the darkened interior. The air inside was stale, and the flickering of emergency lights painted the walls in an eerie, dim glow. Vance motioned for the team to move in, taking the lead. The narrow hallway beyond was silent for a moment, but Vance knew it wouldn't last. The sound of distant gunfire echoed through the complex, mingling with the hiss of the emergency ventilation system. We need to clear this area. Fast, Vance muttered. He moved forward cautiously, every muscle tensed. His eyes flicked from corner to corner, scanning for movement. Briggs, Patel, watch the flanks. Kale, get to that console. Kale nodded, moving swiftly toward the central terminal. His fingers danced across the keyboard. accessing the relay systems as the rest of the team prepared for the inevitable attack. The first shots rang out from behind them. Vance spun just in time to see a wave of Vorak soldiers round the corner, their grotesque bodies surging forward with terrifying speed. "Contact!" Vance shouted, raising his weapon. The air crackled as gunfire erupted, the distinct sounds of plasma rifles and bullet casings filling the air. Briggs and Patil immediately returned fire, their shots accurate and deadly. The Vorak soldiers, in their crude, insectoid armor, seemed to shrug off most of the blasts, but every shot that hit them caused a slight hesitation, a small fraction of a second where they stumbled, long enough for Vance and the others to push forward. "Cale, how long?" Vance shouted over the roar of battle. "Almost there. Just give me a minute." Cale's voice was strained, but he didn't slow down. His hands worked with a feverish intensity, as if the weight of humanity's survival rested on his every keystroke. Vance aimed carefully and took out another Vorak soldier, his plasma rifle slicing through the air with deadly accuracy. But the Vorak were relentless, more of them pouring from the shadows like a flood. He could feel the pressure mounting as the enemy closed in. Patil's voice crackled over the comms. "Vance, we're not going to hold them off much longer." "Cale," Vance shouted again. "We need that relay now." "Got it." Cal's voice came through, stronger now, though his breath was ragged. He hit a final command, and the terminal lit up. The room's overhead lights flickered, and the low hum of the relay station kicked into full power. "The message is going out, Captain," Cale said, breathless but triumphant. "To Earth, to the Concord, and to the entire galaxy. The truth is out there." Vance allowed himself a brief breath of relief. The message had been sent. Humanity would no longer be silenced. They had delivered their final warning. But there was no time to celebrate. The Vorak were still closing in, their weapons raised, their war cries echoing through the station. "Fall back," Vance ordered. "We've done what we came for. Get to the escape route." The team fought their way back toward the exit, the sound of their boots pounding against the metal floors as they moved. Cale, despite his injuries, moved with surprising speed, keeping close to Vance. His face was pale, but his eyes were filled with a new kind of fire, the fire of a man who had been part of something bigger than himself. The message had been sent, but now they had to survive long enough to see its impact, and the real war was just beginning. The escape route was a labyrinth of tunnels, and the sounds of the battle above them were growing louder, closer. Vance's team moved fast, their breaths heavy in the stale air, but there was no mistaking the reality of their situation. The Vorak weren't just hunting them. They were closing in from all sides. The air was thick with the smell of burning metal and charred flesh, and the ground beneath their boots seemed to pulse with the weight of each incoming blast. Cale was still moving, though his pace had slowed as the toll of his injuries took its toll. His face was drawn, his body battered, but his resolve hadn't wavered. Vance could feel the weight of the man's sacrifice and the purpose in his eyes. They were all in this together now. Griggs kept his eyes on the rear, occasionally firing a burst of gunfire at the Vorak soldiers creeping in from the shadows. Patil, ever watchful, scanned the paths ahead, her fingers flexing on her weapon. Every corner, every darkened passage was a threat. But they couldn't stop. They couldn't afford to hesitate. "We're close," Vance said through gritted teeth. "Keep moving. We just need to make it to the evac zone." But the closer they got to the surface, the more they realized the odds were stacking against them. The colony was falling. The sounds of destruction were everywhere now. Explosions, screaming, the shrill whine of alien weapons tearing through human defenses. Then, as if the Vorak had been waiting for that precise moment, they descended on them. A dozen soldiers emerged from the shadows at once, their insectoid forms charging with unnatural speed. The first line of defense, the makeshift barricades the team had set earlier, had fallen long ago. Now it was just them, Vance, Cale, Briggs, Patel, and the oncoming tide of death. "Move! Move!" Vance shouted as he snapped off shots at the approaching horde. The plasma blasts hit their marks, but the Vorak's thick, chitinous armor absorbed most of the damage. "We can't fight our way through," Briggs shouted back, a note of panic creeping into his voice. "We need backup." Vance didn't have the luxury of waiting for reinforcements. They were the backup. There was no one else coming. "Kale," Vance yelled. "Is there another way out?" Kel's voice was weak, but he managed a strained nod. "The secondary tunnel. It's an old maintenance shaft. It'll get you to the surface." "We're taking it then," Vance barked. He grabbed Cal's arm, urging him forward as the team scrambled toward the exit, fighting off the Vorak at every turn. The secondary tunnel was barely wide enough for all of them to fit, but it was their only hope. The alien soldiers were relentless, and the few that remained from the initial assault had regrouped, cutting off all other possible escape routes. Vance pushed through, his heart pounding as he led the team into the claustrophobic shaft. The walls were close, the air stale and thick with the smell of smoke. Behind them, the Vorak advanced. Their claws clicked against the metal floor, their screeches reverberating through the tunnel. The team moved faster, desperation fueling their every step. "We can't outrun them like this," Patil gasped, sweat beading on her forehead. "We need to hold them off." "We don't have the time," Vance snapped, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He reached into his pack, pulling out a small explosive device. "If they're close, we're setting this off. It'll buy us time." The secondary tunnel was winding and tight, a maze of old conduits and maintenance shafts. Their footsteps echoed eerily, but the Vorak were getting closer. Vance could hear their screeches, the thumping of their armored feet as they stalked through the narrow spaces. "This is it," Briggs muttered, his rifle ready, sweat dripping down his face. "There's no turning back now." Kale, now visibly exhausted, stopped for a moment to catch his breath. His fingers twitched, and he looked up at Vance. "Captain, you need to know." The message went out. Vance nodded grimly. "I know. We'll make sure it's heard, Kale. Your sacrifice won't be forgotten." "We're not out of this yet." Kel's voice was weak but defiant. He gave Vance a tight, brief smile. "They won't be expecting humanity to strike back. But when they do, we'll make sure they remember." Vance's chest tightened as they reached the exit, an old service hatch that led out to the surface. The sky above was a sickly red, the atmosphere still scorched from the ongoing assault. But the ground was littered with debris, smoke rising in plumes from the ruined colony. They were close, but not far enough. The Vorak were still chasing them, their screeches now deafening. They had to move, and fast. "Get to the evac point," Vance ordered. "We'll hold them off, then take whatever ship we can find." The team ran out into the open, the air thick with dust. The Vorak charged behind them, their weapons crackling with energy as they raced to catch up. But as Vance reached the makeshift landing pad, he glanced back, knowing that this would be the final stand. They would either escape or die trying. A lone shuttle waited in the distance, its engines humming softly. They just had to survive long enough to reach it. And they would. Because humanity had always fought when it was cornered. And it was about to show the Vorak just how far it would go to survive. The shuttle was their only hope. Vance's heart raced as he sprinted toward it, the sound of the Vorak closing in behind them like a living nightmare. The narrow landing pad seemed 1,000 miles away, the chaos of the battle raging around them, but there was no turning back now. Briggs and Patil were right behind him, firing at the approaching Vorak with precision. Their shots were fast, deadly, each one finding its mark in the alien soldier's armor. But the Vorak didn't stop. They were relentless, an unstoppable force of nature. The ground beneath them vibrated as the aliens surged forward, their screeches filling the air. "We're not going to make it, Captain," Briggs shouted, his voice strained with urgency. He turned, firing once more as a Vorak soldier lunged toward them. The alien's chest exploded in a burst of light, but another took its place. And then another. Vance's breath was ragged as he ran, the shuttle now only a few hundred yards away. The sky above was a mass of swirling clouds, the red glow of Vesper 9's destruction lighting up the horizon. "We'll make it," Vance muttered to himself, his voice low but determined. He had to believe it. For Kale, for every soldier who had died fighting, for every person who had ever believed that humanity was worth saving, they had to survive this. They had to show the galaxy that humanity would never fall quietly into the night. "Cover me," Vance shouted. He turned, moving backward as he slowed his pace, focusing his fire on the aliens pouring through the smoke. One shot after another, the blasts struck true, but there were so many. It was a desperate gamble. Briggs and Patel kept firing, their backs pressed against the shuttle now, their faces grim but resolute. Kale was moving more slowly, his body battered and weak, but he pushed forward, his eyes locked on the shuttle's rear hatch, the only way out of this hellscape. The last of the Vorak surged forward, their claws outstretched, ready to tear the humans apart. But then, from behind them, there was a sudden, deafening roar. The ground shook, and a brilliant flash of light erupted from the sky above. Vance's eyes widened. A blast, one so powerful it seemed to come from the heavens, ripped through the Vorak lines, sending them flying in every direction. A second and third explosion followed, and for a moment, the world was nothing but fire and smoke. "What the hell?" Patel shouted, looking up in confusion. And then, as if by miracle, a fleet of ships descended from the sky. These weren't the Vorak. These were Concord ships, but they were unlike any Vance had ever seen. They were smaller, sleek, with a sharp predatory design. The banners of the Concord fluttered on the ships, but they weren't the same colors. They were different. "It's them." Kel's voice was hoarse, but there was a gleam of recognition in his eyes. "The Resistance. They've come for us." A massive shuttle, more advanced, more powerful, descended lower, its massive engines kicking up debris as it lowered to the landing pad. Its hatch opened, and a squad of humans, armed to the teeth, emerged, charging toward the survivors. "Get in, now," the voice shouted over the comms, its tone unmistakable. Vance didn't hesitate. With one final glance at the smoke-filled horizon, he turned and ran toward the shuttle, the rest of the team following closely behind. They were almost there, but not quite. The Vorak, their monstrous forms emerging from the chaos, weren't done yet. They charge, a last-ditch effort to wipe out the humans who had somehow defied them. But just as Vance reached the hatch, a massive explosion rang out. The rear of the Vorak line was engulfed in fire and debris, and when the smoke cleared, it was clear. Their advance had been stopped. The humans who had descended from the ships fired relentlessly, clearing a path as they fought off the last of the alien attackers. Vance and the others scrambled inside the shuttle, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The hatch slammed shut, and the engines roared to life. Vance collapsed into one of the seats, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked around at his team. Briggs, Patel, Kale, all of them alive, though wounded. They had made it. "We did it, Captain." Briggs's voice was quiet, almost in disbelief. Vance didn't answer right away. His mind was racing, processing everything that had happened. The battle, the betrayal by the Concord, the message that had been sent to the galaxy. But one thing stood out more than anything else. Humanity had survived. The shuttle ascended, leaving the burning ruins of Vesper 9 behind. But as Vance stared out the viewport, watching the colony become nothing more than a speck in the distance, he knew the fight was far from over. The message had been sent, but humanity's true war was just beginning. And this time, the galaxy would know who was truly in charge. The humans were no longer just pawns in a galactic experiment. They were a force to be reckoned with. The stars ahead were silent, waiting.